On today's episode of Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez, my film review is Pan's Labyrinth, followed by my segment Allow Me to Explain, and it all starts right now. This is Jordan Ramirez, and you are listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. And now, here is my latest film review. My film review for this episode is Pan's Labyrinth, released in 2006, directed by Guillermo del Toro, starring Ivana Pequero, Ariadna Gil, Sergi Lopez, Maribel Verdú, and Doug Jones. Here is the synopsis of the film. It is Spain, 1944, during the reign of Francisco Franco when he was in power. Ofelia, played by Ivana Pequero, and her mother, Carmen, played by Ariadna Gil, are at the mill to meet with her new husband, the ruthless and sadistic Captain Vidal, played by Sergi Lopez, and of course, Ofelia's stepfather, to crush the resistance fighters who are hiding in the woods. The mill is occupied with Captain Vidal's men, Dr. Ferrero, played by Alex Angulo, taking care of Carmen, who is sick with child, and the maid Mercedes, played by Maribel Verdú, an independent and strong character throughout the film. As Ofelia and her mother are at the mill as part of the fascist headquarters, she starts to follow a magical ferry, which leads her to the labyrinth. Inside the labyrinth and underneath the stairs resides a faun, played by Doug Jones, who is excited for the return of Princess Moana, who has been reincarnated as Ofelia. He tells her that she is the daughter of a king and queen of the underworld, and that her father, the king, had opened many portals to find his long-lost daughter. In order for her to return back to see her father and mother of this underworld kingdom, she must complete 3 tasks. Should she fail to complete them, she will be mortal, and her memories of being a princess will forever fade away. Will she listen to these words and complete the task to return to the kingdom from whence she came, or will she fail? What do I think of the film? It is an interesting dark fantasy fairy tale film that we as film viewers have become so familiar with from reading fairy tales as children or seeing them in art form of animation, television, feature films, literature, and even fan fiction. I do admire Del Toro subverting a familiar genre by adding his own little twists to make it completely original in his own way. When you are watching the film, I do not think of it as a horror movie because it's a misconception. It is a fantasy film that is set during one of the horrific chapters in the history of Spain during the fascist regime of Francisco Franco. It is very emblematic in the film that I can see in today's environment when you watch it, and it feels so relevant. The one thing that I saw from this film is that the past is never dead, and it can come back in many different forms and ways. The film's plot does, however, remind me of the mythological hero stories that I remembered studying when I was at USF regarding the task brought by Perseus and Heracles in Greek mythology. While I admire the performances in the film from Ivana Pequero's role as Ofelia, Ariadna Gil as Carmen, and Doug Jones as the faun, I would have put in the role of Captain Vidal, played by Sergi Lopez. But I felt that the only performer who stole the show for me was Maribel Verdú as Mercedes. Her performance, albeit subtle and natural, makes her character feel strong and empowering throughout the film, in which she helps her brother Pedro, who is the leader of the resistance fighters hiding in the woods against the fascists, with loving and nurturing care. When it comes to learning about the themes that are used throughout this film, some of them that stick out to me as I was watching them are fantasy versus reality, feminism, fascism, rebellion, family, and life and death. When it comes to fantasy versus reality, I'll put out a scene for an example to back up my point. Carmen tells her daughter in one sequence that she should not read fairy tales and that she has to learn to put away childish things as she approaches maturity. And then a later scene in the movie, Carmen tells her that life is not simple like a fairy tale and that the real world is a very dark and dangerous place. I also felt that it was a feminist picture because of the strong female characters in Mercedes and Ofelia, but also that Mercedes was the only strong character out of the ones in the film, because Ophelia felt more vulnerable and insecure, and she was somewhat flawed, who would succumb to curiosity and temptation that would often lead her into trouble. But I feel like that she is more of a human character who often learns from her mistakes than someone who doesn't. It is a great fantasy film for adults, and I hope that you enjoy this as a high recommendation from me. The journey of this film came from Guillermo del Toro's notebooks, which are filled with his, quote, doodles, ideas, drawings, and plot bits, end quote. He had kept these notebooks for more than 20 years, and according to Sergei Lopez, who stars in the film, he said that Del Toro told him the whole plot before filming began. He said, quote, for 2 hours and a half, he explained to me all the movie, but with all the details. It was incredible. And when he finished, I said, you have a script? He said, no, nothing is written. He agreed to act in the film and received the script the next year. Lopez said, quote, it was exactly the same. It was incredible. In his little head, he had all the history with a lot of little detail, a lot of characters, like now when you look at the movie. It was exactly what he had in his head, end quote. For the fawn, Del Toro stated on the Charlie Rose Show that every midnight he would wake up and a fawn would gradually step out from behind the grandfather's clock. The fawn was originally supposed to be a half-man, half-goat who was beautiful, but it was scrapped to make the fawn look anthropomorphic and made of earth, moss, tree bark, and vines. The film was meant to be the sequel to The Devil's Backbone that deals with the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War between the rebellions and the fascists that is now expanded in this feature film. Other inspirations that were incorporated into this film were Lewis Carroll's Alice books, Jorge Luis Borges's Ficciones, Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan, and The White People, Lord Dunsany's The Blessings of Pan, Algernon Blackwood's Pan's Garden, and the works of Francisco Goya. Del Toro said in an interview from 2004, quote, Pan is an original story. Some of my favorite writers, Borges, Blackwood, Machen, Dunsany, have all explored the figure of the god Pan and the symbol of the labyrinth. These are things that I find very compelling, and I am trying to mix them and play with them, end quote. When it comes to the religious influence in the film, Del Toro considered this film, quote, a truly profane film, a layman's riff on Catholic dogma, end quote. His explanation is, once a Catholic, always a Catholic. He also admitted in this same interview that a scene later in the film involving the monstrous pale man eating children rather than the feast in front of him was intentionally meant as a criticism of the Catholic Church. As to whether this fantasy underworld exists in reality or in the mind of Ophelia, Del Toro stated that while he believes that it exists, quote, the movie should tell something different to everyone. It should be a matter of personal discussion, end quote. The film almost never got made. Del Toro's friends and colleagues warned him not to make this film, and there were also difficulties in securing funding for the film that made it even worse for the director. Guillermo del Toro said, quote, the production and the shooting of Pan was very, very hard. A very difficult experience. After Mimic, Pan was the toughest shoot I've ever had, end quote. Del Toro said, quote, shooting Pan's Labyrinth was very painful, but it also became a war about me not compromising. I gave back my entire salary in order to get the film made the way I wanted it. I probably should have abandoned it the moment that the funding fell through the first time, but I stuck with it for almost 2.5 years and refused to back down. The project was unable to get funding and support from every major and independent studio in the United States, but was finally able to get the funding in both Spain and Mexico. Production started in June of 2005 and ended on October that same year. The film was shot in the Scott Pines Forest in the Guadarrama mountain range in central Spain. DP Guillermo Navarro said, quote, after doing work in Hollywood on other movies and with other directors, working in our original language and different scenery brings me back to the original reasons I wanted to make movies, which is basically to tell stories with complete freedom and to let the visuals really contribute to the telling of the story, end quote. While the visual effects of the film comprised of CGI effects, it was also a mixture of makeup effects and animatronics to give it a realistic look. The fawn's makeup, for example, was composed by the team of David Martí, Montse Ribe, and Xavi Bastida. Doug Jones, who played the fawn in the film, spent 5 hours in the makeup chair. The fawn's face and body was done with latex foam. The horns, which weighed 10 pounds, were very exhausting to wear for the face and the head. Jones stood on 20-centimeter high lifts, and the legs of the fawn were attached to his own legs and digitally erased in the final film. The flapping ears and the blinking eyes were operated by Martí and Bastida from DDT Efectos Especiales while they were on the set. For the lead role of Princess Moana and her reincarnation, Ofelia, Del Toro was nervous about casting the lead role, and the casting of Ivana Pequero, who was 10 at the time, was accidental. Del Toro, quote, "The character I wrote was initially younger, about 8 or 9, and Ivana came in, and she was a little older than the character with the curly hair, which I never imagined the girl having. But I loved her first reading. My wife was crying, and the camera woman was crying after her reading, and I knew hands down Ivana was the best actress that had shown up. Yet I knew that I needed to change the screenplay to accommodate her age," end quote. To prepare for the role of Ofelia, Pequero said that Del Toro would send her comics and fairy tales to, quote, "help her get more into the atmosphere of Ofelia and more into what she felt." For the role of Mercedes, Del Toro cast Maribel Verdú because he, quote, "saw a sadness in her which he thought would be perfect for the part," end quote. For the villainous Captain Vidal, Del Toro met Sergio López in Barcelona a year and a half before filming began and asked him to play this role. López at the time was known for his comedic and melodramatic performances. The producers of the film told Del Toro, quote, "You should be very careful because you don't know about these things because you're Mexican, but this guy is not going to be able to deliver this performance," end quote. Del Toro's response? Quote, "Well, it's not that I don't know, it's that I don't care," end quote. López described his character thusly, quote, "He is the most evil character I've ever played in my career. It is impossible to improve upon it. The character is so solid and so well written. Vidal is deranged, a psychopath who is impossible to defend, even though his father's personality marked his existence, and is certainly one of the reasons for his mental disorder. That cannot be an excuse. It would seem to be very cynical to use that to justify or explain his cruel and cowardly acts. I think it is great that this film does not consider any justification of fascism," end quote. As the Fawn, Doug Jones, who previously worked with Del Toro in Mimic and Hellboy, said that the director sent him an email saying, quote, "You must be in this film. No one else can play this part but you," end quote. Jones believed at first that he would receive an English translation of the script, but was terrified to learn that it was in Spanish. Jones was not a fluent speaker of Spanish. Del Toro suggested that Jones would learn his lines phonetically. Jones pushed back and instead wanted to learn the words himself. Doug Jones: "I really buckled down and committed myself to learning that word for word, and I got the pronunciation semi-right before I even went in," end quote. In the end, Del Toro had Jones's voice dubbed by Spanish theater actor Pablo Adán. Since Jones's efforts paid off, and Adán was able to match the delivery put on by Jones's mouth movements. The other cast members of the film included Ariadna Gil as Carmen, Ofelia's mother, Alex Angulo as Dr. Ferrero, and collaborator Federico Lupi as Ofelia's father at the end of the film. A trivia fact about this film: because international films would have to be translated for English-speaking viewers, Del Toro ended up writing the subtitles for the film himself. This was after his disappointment with the subtitles of his previous film, The Devil's Backbone, from 2001. In the interview, Del Toro said that they were, quote, "for the thinking impaired and incredibly bad," end quote. He worked with 2 other people for a month, and he said that he did not want it to, quote, "feel like watching a subtitled film," end quote. The film premiered at the 2006 Cannes Film Festival on May 27th of 2006. For English-speaking audiences, it made its premiere at the London Fright Fest Film Festival on August 25th of that same year in the United Kingdom. It made its US premiere on October 15th at the New York Film Festival, had a premiere in Los Angeles on December 18th, and had limited screenings on December 29th the same year, and premiered nationwide on January 19th, 2007. Critical reception for the film, for the most part, was positive, and it was a box office hit in the United States as it made $54 million for box office ticket sales. The film would be nominated for 6 Academy Awards, winning 3 for Best Makeup, Best Cinematography, and Best Art Direction. The film was featured on a variety of top 10 critic films lists, including The Observer from Mark Kermode, Chicago Sun-Times from Roger Ebert, and Time Magazine from Richard Corliss, just to name a few examples. We will be right back with Allow Me to Explain. The 2022 midterm election is less than 2 weeks away, and there is a lot at stake when it comes to the main issues that we care about: democracy, voting rights, autonomy rights, our planet, and even oversight in the federal and state government. But the one thing that has been coming up lately is voter intimidation and what can be done to challenge it. It's time for Allow Me to Explain. I am pretty sure that you have heard of this story involving poll watchers in Maricopa County, Arizona, who have harassed and intimidated voters. A lawsuit by 2 different organizations, the Arizona Alliance for Retired Americans and Voto Latino, filed a restraining order in the U.S. District Court of Arizona. The lawsuit mentions 2 different federal investigations signed into law that were violated by the right-wing grassroots group Clean Elections USA, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. So I will break this up as best as I can. First off, what is the definition of voter intimidation, and what are some examples of this? According to ACLU, the federal law states that, quote, "No person shall intimidate, threaten, coerce any other person for the purpose of interfering with the right of that person to vote or to vote as he may choose," end quote. Examples of this include, number 1, aggressively questioning voters about their citizenship, criminal record, or other qualifications to vote in a manner intended to interfere with the voters' rights. Number 2, presenting yourself falsely as an election official. Number 3, spreading misinformation about voter requirements, such as an ability to speak English or the need to present certain types of photo ID. Some states do not require that. Number 4, display false or misleading signs about voter fraud. Number 5, or watching the ballots or the polls with armed weapons or displaying vigilantism. What we have seen, however, is on a new level in the United States after the 2020 election. Let's think back to the history of voter intimidation. I'm going to play for you now an audio clip from retroreport.org that explains the history of voter intimidation.
Partisan poll watchers have been part of elections since at least the 1800s, when fraud was common, and voting could be a dangerous proposition.
Voting in the 19th century in the United States took place openly. Everyone could see who you were voting for, what ballot you cast. And in that environment, the polls became a really raucous place. Violence and intimidation at the polls ranged from verbal threats to outright gunplay, stabbings.
New laws ushered in reforms to protect the voting process, like secret ballots and official monitors.
Official poll watchers were appointed to go to the polls and make sure that no fraud and intimidation was taking place. But there was also unofficial poll watching, and unofficial poll watching developed very quickly in the 19th century into often a form of voter suppression and intimidation.
After the end of slavery, some states passed laws allowing citizens to challenge a person's right to vote.
There's one famous case where a group of people, white intimidators, came out to a predominantly black area, stood around the polls with guns, and claimed that they were deputy U.S. Marshals there to ensure the safety of the polls. And they threatened and scared off about 175 black voters.
Some of the most notorious acts of voter intimidation took place in the 1950s and 60s as black Americans fought for their voting rights. Then, in 1981, a political scandal broke out when the Republican National Committee sent a ballot security task force to predominantly black and Latino neighborhoods in New Jersey. They posted warning signs like this one near the polls.
Allegations that minority voters were intimidated by task force workers have surfaced in several cities.
Republican poll watchers, some of them off-duty policemen wearing guns and armbands, were also near the polls.
Do I think it's intimidating? From soup to nuts, I think it's intimidating and not what our democracy contemplated.
Angelo Genova was a lawyer for the Democrats. They sued for voter intimidation and discrimination, and a settlement required the Republican National Committee to get court approval for future ballot security plans.
To me, its heart resided in a provision that made it a violation to engage in any activities that had the effect of deterring African American voters or Latino voters from participating in elections.
That settlement, or consent decree, was invoked again after other allegations of Republicans intimidating or excluding minority voters. It expired in 2017, making 2020 the first presidential election in 40 years where the Republican National Committee is able to conduct poll watching without court supervision.
During the 2020 presidential election, there was a vast number of extremists and far-right groups encouraged by the Republican National Committee to harass and intimidate voters and poll workers at polling sites across the country. The Democratic Party, in turn, decided to help poll workers and their base by not being intimidated and go straight to the polls without any harm or violence. The latest threats, echoed by extremist figures on the right such as former President Trump and Steve Bannon, has now set forth a new worrisome trend that is of grave concern as the midterms are less than 2 weeks away. A new poll from Reuters Ipsos shows that 2 out of 5 Americans are worried about voter intimidation at polling places. 51% of Democrats are concerned compared to 38% of Republicans. 67% of the majority, including 3/4 of Democrats and 3/5 of Republicans, are worried about extremist violence. According to Axios, the U.S. Conference of Mayors held an event this week warning of decentralized election interference efforts targeting local voters, candidates, and election workers. Mary McCord, executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection and former Justice Department prosecutor, said, quote, "We've seen them dismantle some of their nationwide organizations, so the Proud Boys dismantle nationally in favor of state chapters. The 3 percenters did the same. We're seeing similar types of threats today, but now the attacks are coming from a very ground-up, localized effort," end quote. Some of the far-right extremist groups in the country are now having their members sign up as poll watchers and workers to legitimately infiltrate and disrupt elections from the ground up. What I have shared with you, my fellow listeners, is a very frightening and disturbing trend that is nothing new, but has been with us in the United States for more than 100 years, and its legacy is very brutal at this moment, along with election subversion and voter suppression, such as in my home state of Florida. That I cannot even begin to contemplate, and making the matters even worse, because of the ongoing voter intimidation and harassment tactics by extremists and followers of the big lie who intend to disrupt the voting process, we are now witnessing the biggest exodus of poll workers leaving their posts to properly handle the election that election deniers and extremists would now be in charge of just less than 2 weeks before the election. And I will say this again without emphasis. So, what can we do about this? Well, I don't have any easy solutions that can help solve this issue, but there are a few things that you can do right now. There are still less than 2 weeks left before the midterms, and if you have not done so already, I urge my fellow listeners to sign up as poll workers. That is one way that can be resolved. It may sound like I am pandering at this moment, but we need more help now than ever. If you witness or are threatened by voter intimidation, do not confront the intimidator. It is for your own safety and the safety of others. Another tactic is to alert the municipal clerk or election official at your local polling locations. Use your cell phone to record the incident. You have the power to do this. And also to send this piece of evidence to your local county board of elections and county district attorney. Call the Election Protection Hotline at 866-OUR-VOTE. If you feel that you are being unfairly targeted just because you are exercising your right to vote in this year's midterm election. Tell your friends and family members that we need more poll workers and that if there is no call to action, then the extremists win. And also, make sure to show up on Election Day. Make sure you show up on Election Day because we need a big blowout at this moment to save democracy. Take this into consideration. I know this may sound like sour news at the moment, but I want to bring back to reality and why we should care and why democracy right now is hanging by a thread that will never come back if there is no call to action at this moment, right now. This has been Allow Me to Explain. You have been listening to Film Talk with Jordan Ramirez. This series is now available to listen to at 4 p.m. on Anchor, Spotify, and Google Podcasts every Friday. And also make sure to tune in every Monday at 12 noon for my mini-sodes. It is also on my blog website, filmtalkwithjordanramirez.wordpress.com, with my latest podcast episode on the page labeled Episodes. You can contact me on my social media feeds such as LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I am also available on Letterboxd. If there is a film that you recommend that I would put for my next review, make sure to submit it to my social media accounts. And until then, I'll see you at the movies.